now that your model is in production and you're finally starting to see how it works with users or maybe with different machines or just whatever environment that is implemented in, you really need to keep an eye on that model because now, since it is receiving that production data, you need to watch how it responds and how it behaves with this new data coming in. So there are quite a few things that you can monitor when you have your model in production, but there are a few things that you should really make sure are just on your checklist of monitoring. So there are two concepts called data drift and concept drift, and we'll talk about those in just a bit. And then you have your model performance. So your model performance is usually when you look at metrics around how accurate it is. So you want to know how well the model is at real-time performance and adaptability to new data. Then you have something called model staleness. So a stale model is one that's been trained on data that's not really up to date, or it doesn't really meet the business requirements anymore. So that just means you have some kind of old model in production. So you'll want to keep an eye out for that model performance, making sure that it stays accurate, and that model staleness, just making sure that the model has relevant data to make its predictions based on. So let's talk a little bit more about the types of drift that you might run into. So first, you have data drift. This is when your data changes. So basically, there's some change to the distribution of the data. Maybe for some reason you've started to get more customers at 9 p.m. and this has drastically changed all of the predictions that you were looking for. It's made you question kind of the business logic behind this model, and you need to go back and basically retrain your model. Then you have concept drift, and this is when the business drifts away from the original goal for the model. So maybe over time you've gotten new data, and now the question that you're trying to answer is just different. So these are two pretty common types of drift that you'll want to check for as that model lives on production. And to keep up with your model and make sure it's still fresh, it's performing well, and you don't have any kind of drift, you'll want to use some kind of tool like one of these. So a little bit later, we'll actually go through an example of implementing model monitoring with Evidently AI. But again, if you're in the AWS ecosystem, you might check out this SageMaker Model Monitor. And then there are a couple of other open source or enterprise tools depending on what you need, but Hydrosphere and Fiddler are some pretty popular ones. So, you'll need to determine again if that model is stale or fresh in production. And the way you'll do that is by periodically checking the numerical stability of the model. So basically, you're going to check some of those key metrics like, are your predictions still accurate? Do they still run within a certain threshold to deliver a prediction to another system? So you'll want to go through and just check that your model is still stable based on the new data that it's been interacting with in production. And one of the ways that you can do this and start to add a little bit of automation is by having predetermined thresholds to determine when retraining is needed. So you have your monitoring in place, but you need to know what you're monitoring for. So maybe you decide it's time to retrain when your model accuracy drops by, let's say, 3%. That's a pretty big drop depending on how much accuracy you need, but it is a threshold that tells you that something has happened with your model on production. So when you have those preset thresholds, you can use MLOps to automatically trigger training. So as we've gone through this pipeline, there have been a few places where you can add some automation, and the experiment phase is one of those areas. So if your model on production falls below a certain threshold, then you can have some kind of script or some tool service that sends this information back to your training stage, and you can run that again and get a new model ready to deploy pretty quickly. So when you're setting up your monitoring, whatever tool you decide to go with, make sure that you set up some alerts, because this is how you figure out how fast your model in production becomes stale or when data drift starts to happen. When you have these alerts, it lets the team know that it's time to do something versus waiting until users have an issue with the model. And don't forget to include your logs. Whenever there's some type of new data coming in or the model encounters something that it hasn't seen before, it's okay to go ahead and log that. It's actually great if you log that because it gives you a really good trail to go through to figure out when, why, where, and how, or even what caused your model to start to drift. So it's like I said, this shows you exactly where things start to change, and that gives you an idea of maybe something happening with the business that means that the data you were receiving changed, or maybe something in world events happened and it changes people's behavior and how they interact with your model.